Part 1. The Iron Collar. The iron collar around her neck gleamed dully in the Wyoming winter sun, crusted with dried blood where the metal had cut into her skin. $8. That's what Ayanna's freedom was worth on that December morning in 1876. The stockyard warehouse in Broken Pine sat at the edge of town like a rotting tooth, its walls warped from years of mountain wind and snow. Inside, the air hung thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and desperation. 40 souls had gathered, maybe 50, their breath forming clouds in the freezing air. Miners with whiskey on their tongues, housewives clutching shawls tight against the cold, their faces pinched with something harder than winter. Children throwing rocks at the cage, laughing when they struck metal. The cage itself was 6 feet square, fashioned from iron bars meant for livestock. Rust bled orange down the corners where morning frost had begun to melt. And in the center, sitting with her spine impossibly straight, was a woman who refused to break. Ayanna. Her name meant eternal blossom in the language of her people, though no one in that crowd knew it. To them, she was simply inventory. Property of the late J. Sterling, deceased 3 weeks prior from a liver pickled in rot-gut whiskey. His worldly possessions were being liquidated to settle debts. The wagon, the mule, the cooking pots, and her. She wore a dress that didn't belong to her, rough calico stained dark under the arms and at the hem. Her feet were bare despite the cold, the soles black with grime. Her face carried the map of recent violence. Purple bloomed along her left cheekbone. Blood had dried at the corner of her mouth where her lip had split. Her temple bore a gash scabbed over, but still angry. But it was the collar that drew the eye. Thick iron 2 inches wide, locked around her throat, the kind of thing a man might use to chain a dog. Engraved across the front in crude letters, Property J. Sterling. The metal had rubbed her skin raw. Fresh blood seeped where the collar sat heaviest against her collarbone. Her hands were bound in front of her with leather straps, wrists crossed like a penitent's prayer. But her eyes held no prayer. They stared forward, dark and distant, looking at nothing and everything. She did not beg. She did not weep. She simply sat in that cage with a dignity that made the crowd uncomfortable, so they laughed louder to cover it. Walter Crawford stood on an overturned crate playing auctioneer. He was 50 and soft around the middle, with a voice that carried like a carnival barker's. "Now then, folks, what am I bid for this here Apache squaw strong back on her good teeth? Can cook, can clean, can do whatever work you set before her." He grinned, yellow teeth catching the light. "Do I hear $8 for a workhorse that don't talk back?" A ripple of laughter. In the back corner, Clayton Hargrove leaned against a timber post, arms crossed over his chest. He was a man who wore wealth like armor. Fine wool coat, leather boots polished to a mirror shine despite the mud outside, silver watch chain glinting at his vest. At 48, Hargrove owned the largest silver mine in the territory, employed half the men in Broken Pine, and believed that ownership extended to people as easily as it did to land. He smiled, not with warmth, with the certainty of a man who always got what he wanted. $5, Hargrove called out, voice casual as ordering breakfast. "That's all she's worth." Crawford's face twitched. He knew who paid his rent. $5 then. Do I hear 6? Silence. Crawford licked his lips. 5 going once. 5 going 8. The word dropped into the warehouse like a stone into still water. Heads turned. Whispers started. Daniel Mackenzie stood in the doorway, snow melting off his shoulders. He was a tall man, broad through the chest and lean everywhere else. 36 years old, but carrying the weight of 40. His face was weathered from sun and wind lines carved deep at the corners of his eyes. Dark hair touched with gray at the temples. 3 days of beard shadowed his jaw. He wore a leather coat that had seen better years, denim trousers and boots that were functional rather than fine. In one hand he held a burlap sack of coffee beans, in the other a coil of rope he'd just purchased from the general store. He had not planned to stop at the warehouse. Had been heading home, in fact, when he'd heard the crowd. Something in the tone of fevered ugliness had pulled him like a hook in the gut. Now he stood there looking at the cage, at the woman inside it, at the collar around her throat. His jaw tightened. Clayton Hargrove pushed off from the post. "Mackenzie," he said the name like it tasted bad. "Didn't figure you for this kind of transaction." Daniel didn't look at him. His eyes stayed on Ayanna. She had turned her head slightly, just enough to see who had spoken. Their gazes met, held. In that moment something passed between them. Not recognition, not yet, but a kind of acknowledgement. 2 people who understood what it meant to lose everything. Daniel had seen that look before, in the mirror. 4 years ago, after scarlet fever took his wife Margaret and his son James in the same terrible week, after he'd buried them on the hill behind his ranch and spent the following months trying to decide if a bullet was mercy or cowardice. He saw it now in this woman's eyes, the awful knowledge that surviving didn't mean living, that you could draw breath and be dead all the same. $8, Daniel said again. Crawford swallowed. Mr. Hargrove had bid 5, and I bid 8. Are we conducting an auction or a coronation? A few nervous laughs scattered through the crowd. Hargrove's smile sharpened. You know what she is? Mackenzie, she's Apache. The same savages who burned out the Henderson place last spring, killed old Henderson and his boy, took the wife and did God knows what before she threw herself in the river. I know what she is, Daniel said quietly. A woman in a cage. She's property. Then I'm buying her. Why? The question came sharp. Hargrove stepped closer, boots echoing on the warehouse floor. You running low on livestock? Or maybe you got other uses in mind? He let the insinuation hang in the cold air. Daniel's hand moved to his hip where his Colt point .45 rested in its holster. He didn't draw it, didn't need to. The gesture was enough. You want to finish that thought, Clayton, or you want to walk away while you still can? Silence crashed down like a fallen tree. Hargrove's face went red, then white. His hands curled into fists at his sides, but he was a businessman, not a fighter. He measured odds like he measured ore, and right now the odds said Daniel Mackenzie had killed men in the war and wouldn't hesitate to add one more. Your funeral, Hargrove said finally. He turned and shoved his way through the crowd, his son Dalton and his hired gun, Victor Kane, falling in behind him like dogs at heel. Crawford cleared his throat. $8 then. Sold to Mr. Mackenzie. He banged a gavel against the crate. The sound cracked through the warehouse. Final. Daniel walked forward, setting down his coffee and rope. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch, counting coins into his palm. 4 silver dollars, $2 bills worn soft at the creases, and a handful of smaller coins that clinked as he counted them. He poured the money into Crawford's waiting hand. It was everything he had, the last of his savings. Enough to buy seed for spring planting or a medicine if he fell sick or 100 other necessities. Gone now. Traded for a woman he didn't know, for reasons he couldn't fully explain, even to himself. Crawford pocketed the money and produced a key from his vest. He unlocked the cage door. The hinges screamed. Ayanna didn't move. Daniel crouched down beside the cage, careful not to touch the bars. Eye level now, close enough to see the fine tremor in her hands, though her face remained stone. My name is Daniel Mackenzie, he said. His voice was low, meant only for her. I'm not here to hurt you. I'm not here to own you. I'm here to set you free. Her eyes searched his face, looking for the lie, the trap, the cruelty that always came with soft words. She found none of those things, only exhaustion and a strange, wounded kindness. You can trust me, Daniel continued, or you can spit in my face and walk away right now. Either way, you're not staying in this cage. For a long moment, nothing. Then Ayanna shifted. Slowly, like a woman testing the strength of ice on a frozen lake, she crawled forward. Her bound hands made it awkward. Her bare feet scraped against the metal floor of the cage. But she emerged into the warehouse, into the space beyond the bars, and stood. Her legs shook. She did not fall. Daniel straightened. He shrugged out of his leather coat, the cold biting through his shirt immediately. He held the coat out to Ayanna. For the cold, he said. She stared at it. Then, with movements careful as prayer, she took it, drew it around her shoulders. The coat swallowed her small frame sleeves, hanging past her fingertips. But it was warm, and it was freely given. Something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not yet, but perhaps the first fragile seed of it. The crowd had begun to disperse, muttering among themselves. Daniel heard the words they threw like stones. Savage lover, Indian sympathizer, fool. He ignored them all, picked up his rope and coffee, turned toward the door. Stopped. Are you coming? He asked without looking back. A pause. Then the soft shuffle of bare feet on frozen ground behind him. They walked through broken pine together, an unlikely pair. Daniel tall and silent, leading his chestnut mare Ranger by the reins. Ayanna a step behind, wrapped in his coat, the iron collar still locked around her throat like a brand of shame. People stared. A woman pulled her daughter close, covering the child's eyes. A miner spat in their direction, the glob of tobacco juice landing inches from Ayanna's feet. She did not flinch, did not react, just kept walking with her spine straight and her eyes forward. At the edge of town, an older man stepped into their path. Reverend Samuel Hayes, silver-haired and stern-faced, wearing the black coat and white collar of his calling. He looked at Daniel with something like sorrow. You know what you're doing, son? No, Reverend, I don't. Then why do it? Daniel glanced back at Ayanna, at the collar, at the blood. Because it's right. Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a single coin, pressed it into Daniel's palm. Your wife was a good woman, Daniel. She wouldn't want you to lose yourself to grief, but she wouldn't want you to lose yourself to anger either. Remember that. I will. The Reverend stepped aside. Let them pass. 3 miles outside town, Daniel stopped beside a frozen creek called Little Creek. Cottonwoods and willows clustered along the bank's bare branches, rattling in the wind. He tied Ranger to a tree and knelt at the creek's edge, breaking through the thin ice to scoop water into his canteen. Ayanna stood a few feet away, watching him with the wariness of a wild thing that had learned kindness was often just cruelty wearing a mask. Daniel pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, clean, or as clean as a bachelor's handkerchief ever got. He wet it with water from the canteen, rose, turned to face her. You're bleeding, he said. May I? She didn't answer, but she didn't move away either. Slowly, giving her every chance to refuse, Daniel lifted the cloth to her face, dabbed gently at the dried blood on her temple. The cut beneath was shallow but ugly. It would scar. He moved to her split lip, cleaning the crusted blood away, her cheek where the bruise had turned the color of rotted plums. His hands were careful, practiced. My wife, he said quietly. She was a nurse before we married. Taught me how to tend wounds. He paused. She died 4 years ago, her and our son. Fever took them both in the same week. Ayanna's eyes flickered, the first sign of emotion beyond wariness. I know what it's like, Daniel continued, to lose everything, to keep breathing when all you want is to stop. He lowered the cloth, met her gaze. So I'm not going to lie to you and say it gets better, but I will tell you this. You're alive. And as long as you're alive, there's a chance for something more than pain. For a moment, the only sound was wind through winter branches. Then Ayanna spoke. Her voice was rough from disuse, accented but clear. My husband, she said. Dakota and my daughters, Kaya and Nayeli. Her throat worked. They are dead. I'm sorry. Sorry does not bring them back. No, Daniel agreed. It doesn't. They stood in the cold, two souls, bound by lost strangers who understood each other better than most friends ever would. Finally, Daniel gestured to Ranger. It's another 2 miles to my ranch. You can ride if you want, or walk, your choice. Ayanna looked at the horse, then at Daniel. Making calculations he could only guess at. Trust was a luxury. She had none to spare. I will walk, she said. All right. They continued on, Daniel leading the horse, Ayanna following silent and watchful. The sun hung low in the winter sky, painting the snow with shades of gold and blue. By the time they crested the last hill and Daniel's ranch came into view, shadows were growing long. The ranch was modest, a single-story cabin built from pine logs chinked with mud and moss. A barn sagging slightly on one side but still standing, corral fence made from split rails. Chicken coop currently empty after a fox had gotten in last month. Beyond it all, the Bighorn Mountains rose like the spine of the world, peaks white against the darkening sky. It's not much, Daniel said, but it's home. Ayanna said nothing. She was looking at the cabin with an expression Daniel couldn't read. Maybe seeing a prison, maybe seeing possibility, maybe both. He led her inside. The cabin was cold, the fire long since dead. Dust coated the table and the few pieces of rough furniture. On a shelf above the fireplace sat a framed photograph face down. Daniel didn't turn it over. Hadn't in 4 years. You can sleep in there, he said, pointing to a small room off the main area. It was my son's room. I'll sleep in the barn. Why? The question came sharp. Why what? Why do you give me your house? Why do you sleep in the cold? Daniel met her eyes. Because I want you to feel safe. And you won't feel safe if I'm sleeping 10 feet away. Ayanna studied him, looking for the angle, the lie, finding only honesty, which perhaps was more confusing than deception would have been. The collar, she said, finally touching the iron at her throat. Can you remove it? The lock is broken. I'll need tools. Tomorrow I'll cut it off. I promise. A promise. Such a small word to carry such weight. Ayanna nodded once, turned and walked into the small bedroom, closed the door softly behind her. Daniel stood alone in the cold cabin. He built a fire on the hearth, watching flames catch and grow. Outside, night settled over the Wyoming territory like a blanket. Stars emerged hard and bright in the thin mountain air. He thought about the $8, about the look in Ayanna's eyes, about the promise he'd just made, and for the first time in 4 years, Daniel Mackenzie felt something other than the weight of grief. He felt purpose. Fragile and uncertain, but there all the same. In the bedroom, Ayanna sat on the edge of the small bed. The mattress was thin but clean. The room smelled of dust and old memories. Through the gap beneath the door, firelight painted a golden line across the floor. She touched the collar again, felt the weight of it, the degradation of it. Tomorrow, he said, he would cut it off. She wanted to believe him, wanted to trust that this man with sad eyes and gentle hands was different from the others. But trust was a thing she had lost, along with everything else. Trust got you killed. Trust got your children murdered while you watched helpless. Still, she was not in a cage. She was in a room with a door she could open, wearing a coat given freely. And the man who had bought her freedom, if that's what this was, had asked for nothing in return. Not yet, whispered the voice of experience. Not yet, but he will. Ayanna lay down on the bed, still wearing Daniel's coat. She did not sleep, just stared at the ceiling, listening to the crackle of fire and the sound of wind against the cabin walls. Outside in the barn, Daniel spread a bedroll in an empty stall. Ranger nickered softly, nosing his shoulder. He stroked the mare's neck absently, his mind elsewhere. He thought about Margaret, about the promise he'd made to her on her deathbed. Promise me you'll never let cruelty win. Fight for those who can't fight for themselves. He'd tried to keep that promise by simply enduring, by not putting a bullet in his skull when the grief became too much. But enduring wasn't fighting. It was just existing. Today, for the first time, he had fought. Not with fists or guns, though he would if it came to that. He had fought with the only thing he had left that mattered. His word, his honor, his stubborn, foolish belief that one person could make a difference in another person's hell. Sleep came slowly, and with it, dreams of a woman in an iron collar and a future he couldn't yet see, but felt pulling at him like a tide. Outside the barn, hidden in the shadow of the tree line, a figure watched the cabin. Victor Kane sat on his horse breath, misting in the cold eyes like chips of ice. He had followed them from town, watched them stop at the creek, watched them arrive at the ranch. Now he turned his horse and rode back toward Broken Pine, back toward Clayton Hargrove's estate, back to report what he had seen. And in the darkness, the wind carried the promise of violence to come. Part 2. Cutting the Chains. Dawn broke cold and clear over the Bighorn Mountains, painting the snow with shades of rose and gold. Inside the cabin, frost had formed intricate patterns on the window panes, each crystal catching the early light like tiny diamonds. The temperature had dropped to 15 below during the night, cold enough to freeze water solid in its bucket, cold enough to make bones ache. Daniel woke in the barn to the sound of Ranger stamping restlessly in her stall. His breath came out in white clouds as he sat up, his back protesting from a night spent on frozen ground despite the bedroll. He was 36, but felt 60 in moments like this, his body carrying memories of war wounds and hard labor like a ledger of pain. He stood, joints cracking, and pulled on his coat. Through the gap in the barn door he could see smoke rising from the cabin's chimney, thin and gray against the morning sky. Someone had built a fire. Ayanna. Daniel crossed the yard, boots crunching through snow that had fallen during the night. A light dusting, nothing serious, but enough to erase all tracks from yesterday. A clean slate. He found himself hoping it was a sign. He pushed open the cabin door. Warmth hit him immediately, blessed and welcome. The fire crackled in the hearth, built properly with kindling and larger logs arranged to burn slow and steady, not the work of someone unfamiliar with cold or survival. Ayanna stood at the small iron stove in the corner, her back to him. She had removed his coat and folded it neatly on the chair. Beneath it she still wore the rough calico dress, stained and torn. The iron collar gleamed at her throat, impossible to ignore. Her hands moved with quiet efficiency, stirring something in the pot that sat on the stove. The smell hit him then. Oatmeal. Simple and plain, but cooked with care. His stomach growled, reminding him he hadn't eaten since yesterday morning. Ayanna turned at the sound of the door closing. For a moment they stood looking at each other across the small room. Her face was still marked with bruises, the cut on her temple angry and red. But in the morning light, Daniel could see past the violence to the woman beneath. High cheekbones, strong jaw, eyes that had seen too much but refused to surrender completely. She was perhaps 27, he guessed. Young though, suffering had aged her beyond her years. "You did not need to do this," Daniel said, gesturing at the fire of the food. "I know." Her voice was quiet but steady. "But I wanted to." There was something in those words, a claim to agency, a declaration that she was not simply receiving charity, but choosing to participate. It was a small thing, cooking breakfast. But small things mattered when you had been stripped of everything else. Daniel hung his coat on a peg by the door and moved to the table. "Thank you." She ladled oatmeal into 2 simple tin vessels that had seen better days. No sugar to sweeten it, no cream, just oats and water cooked until soft. She set one bowl in front of him, then took the other for herself. Sat across from him at the scarred wooden table. They ate in silence. Not the awkward silence of strangers unsure what to say, but something deeper, a shared understanding that words were less important than presence. Daniel had forgotten what it felt like to share a meal with another person. 4 years of eating alone had made him forget the simple comfort of it. When they finished, Ayanna collected the bowls and took them to the bucket of water by the door. She washed them carefully, thoroughly, as if the act itself held meaning. "The collar," Daniel said. "I can remove it now, if you're ready." She went very still. Her hands stopped moving in the water. For a long moment she didn't turn around. When she did, her face was carefully blank, but her eyes held something Daniel recognized. Fear. Not of him, he thought, but of hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope could break you worse than cruelty ever did. "You are certain you can do this?" she asked. "Yes. And if you cannot, then I'll find someone who can, but I won't stop trying." Ayanna searched his face, looking for the lie, the moment when his patience would break and reveal the monster beneath. She found only a tired man with honest eyes. "All right," she said finally. Daniel retrieved his tools from the barn, a chisel-tempered steel with a wooden handle worn smooth from use, a hammer heavy and solid, a file in case the chisel didn't work. He carried them back into the cabin and set them on the table with care. Ayanna sat in the chair, spine straight, hands folded in her lap. The collar sat heavy at her throat, the engraved words mocking in the morning light. "Property, J. Sterling." "This might hurt," Daniel warned. "I'll be as gentle as I can, but the metal is thick. I have endured worse." The simple statement carried the weight of nightmare. Daniel didn't ask what worse meant, didn't need to. The bruises on her face told enough of that story. He knelt beside the chair so their eyes were level. "If you need me to stop at any point, just say so. You're in control here. Understand?" She nodded once. Daniel positioned the chisel against the lock mechanism. The collar had a crude locking system iron pin driven through a hasp. Whoever had made it, likely Sterling himself, had been more concerned with function than craftsmanship. The lock had jammed either from rust or deliberate damage. Didn't matter which. It had to come off. He raised the hammer, brought it down in a controlled strike. The sound rang through the cabin like a bell, metal on metal. The chisel bit into the lock, but didn't break it. Again. Harder this time. The chisel slipped slightly, and Daniel's heart jumped, terrified he'd struck her, but the blade had caught on metal only. Ayanna hadn't flinched, hadn't made a sound. "You all right?" he asked. "Yes. Continue." 3 more strikes, 4, 5. His hands were shaking now, not from weakness, but from the careful control it took to hit hard enough to break the lock without driving the chisel into her flesh. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cold. On the 6th strike something gave, a small sound, almost inaudible, a crack in the metal. "Almost there," Daniel murmured. 1 more strike. The lock broke with a sound like a sigh. The collar's mechanism released, and suddenly the weight of it was in Daniel's hands instead of around Ayanna's throat. He lifted it away carefully, as if removing a live snake, set it on the table with a dull clank. Ayanna sat perfectly still. Her hands moved to her throat, fingers touching the raw skin where the collar had sat for God knows how long, weeks at least, maybe months. The metal had rubbed away, skin leaving behind open wounds that wept clear fluid. Bruises ringed her neck in shades of purple and yellow. "Let me clean those," Daniel said softly. He fetched clean water and a cloth, dabbed at the wounds with a gentleness that would have surprised men who'd served with him in the war. Captain Mackenzie, they'd called him then. Hard man, fair but unforgiving. That man seemed like someone else now, someone from a different life. As he worked cleaning away dried blood and dirt, he noticed Ayanna's breathing had changed. Quick and shallow like someone fighting tears. Her jaw was clenched tight, tendons standing out in her neck. "You can cry," Daniel said quietly. "You're safe here." And that finally broke something inside her. A single tear slipped down her cheek, then another, then a flood, silent and terrible. Her shoulders shook, but she made no sound, as if crying out loud was a luxury she'd been beaten out of. Daniel didn't touch her, didn't try to comfort her with hollow words. He just finished cleaning her wounds and then stepped back, giving her space to feel what she needed to feel. When the tears finally stopped, Ayanna wiped her face with the back of her hand. She looked at the collar sitting on the table, at the words engraved there, at the blood staining the inside rim. "What will you do with it?" she asked, her voice rough. "Whatever you want." She stood, walked to the table, picked up the collar with both hands. The metal was cold and heavy, a physical weight she'd carried for too long. She turned it over, staring at the engraving. Property. I want to bury it, she said. Deep, where no one will ever find it. Then that's what we'll do. They went outside together, Daniel carrying a shovel from the barn. The sky had clouded over gray and heavy, with the promise of more snow. The wind had picked up, carrying with it the bite of the mountains. Daniel chose a spot beneath an old oak tree that stood at the edge of his property. The tree was ancient, scarred by lightning and wind, but still standing, still alive despite everything that had tried to kill it. It seemed fitting. He drove the shovel into the frozen earth. The ground fought him hard as stone from the cold, but he kept digging, sweat soaking his shirt despite the temperature. 1 foot down. 2. 3. 3. He didn't stop until the hole was 4 feet deep, so deep that even spring floods wouldn't unearth what lay buried there. Ayanna knelt at the edge of the hole. She held the collar over the opening arms, trembling slightly. For a moment she just held it there, as if saying goodbye to something. Not the collar itself, but what it represented. Captivity, degradation, the theft of her name and self. Then she let go. The collar fell tumbling end over end, catching the gray light before disappearing into darkness. It hit bottom with a hollow thud that seemed to echo in the cold air. Daniel filled the hole, shoveled dirt and frozen earth back in until the ground was level again, packed it down with the back of the shovel. When he finished, no one would know anything was buried there unless they were looking for it. Ayanna stood watching, one hand pressed against her throat where the collar had been, where her skin could finally breathe, where wounds could finally begin to heal. "It is done," she said softly. "Yes." They stood in silence beneath the oak tree, two people marked by violence, trying to find their way toward something else. Around them, Wyoming stretched vast and indifferent, beautiful and brutal in equal measure. "Thank you," Ayanna said. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him for perhaps the first time, seeing not a white man or a former soldier or a stranger, just seeing Daniel, a man who had kept his promise. "You're free now," Daniel said. "Truly free. You can stay here or you can go. The choice is yours." She considered this. The offer of freedom genuine and without strings. It was a strange gift, terrifying in its openness. "If I stay," she began, then paused, "what would you ask of me? Nothing you don't want to give. I could use help around the ranch if you're willing, but that's a job, not a demand. You'd earn your keep same as any hired hand. And if you decide to leave tomorrow or next week or next month, there will be no hard feelings." Ayanna looked back at the cabin, small and rough but warm. Safe, or as safe as anywhere could be for someone like her. She thought about the alternative. Walking away with nowhere to go, winter closing in every town between here and the reservation, filled with people like Clayton Hargrove who saw her as something less than human. "I will stay," she said to him, "for now." "All right, then." They walked back to the cabin together. Behind them, beneath the oak tree, the iron collar lay buried in the frozen earth. And above them, the first snowflakes of a new storm began to fall. Inside the cabin, Daniel stoked the fire while Ayanna stood at the window, watching snow begin to blanket the world in white. The collar was gone, but its ghost remained. She could still feel the weight of it, could still hear the sound it made when it struck the bars of the cage. But she could also feel something new, something fragile and unfamiliar. Hope, maybe. The afternoon passed in quiet industry. Daniel showed Ayanna around the ranch, such as it was. The barn needed repairs, boards rotting where water had gotten in. The chicken coop stood empty, waiting for spring when he could afford to buy new birds. The corral fence leaned at a dangerous angle, half the posts needing to be reset. 4 years of grief had turned him into a poor steward of his own land. He saw that now, seeing it through her eyes. Saw how close he'd come to letting everything his grandfather had built simply fall into ruin. "Tomorrow I will help you fix the fence," Ayanna said, studying the tilted posts. "You don't have to do that." "I know, but I will." There it was again, that insistence on agency, on choosing rather than being commanded. Daniel understood it, respected it. He simply nodded. As they walked back toward the cabin, a sound carried on the wind. Hoofbeats. Multiple horses moving fast. Daniel's hand went to his hip to the Colt 45 that rode there. "Get inside," he said, his voice suddenly hard with command. But Ayanna didn't move. She stood beside him, eyes scanning the tree-lined body, coiled and ready. Whatever was coming, she would face it standing up. 3 riders emerged from the pines. Daniel recognized them immediately. His jaw tightened, but he didn't draw his weapon. Not yet. Sheriff Tom Bridger rode in front, a big man gone soft in the middle, face weathered and tired. Behind him came 2 of Clayton Hargrove's men. Not Hargrove himself, interestingly. just his hired hands, both of them looking uncomfortable in the cold. Bridger reined in his horse 20 feet from the cabin. He didn't dismount. His eyes moved from Daniel to Ayanna and back again. "Daniel," he said by way of greeting. "Tom, got a complaint filed this morning. Hargrove says you stole his property. I bought her fair and square. Crawford witnessed the transaction. $8. I've got the receipt if you need to see it. That's not what Hargrove says. Says you interfered with his bid. Says the woman belongs to him by rights." Daniel's voice went cold as the wind. "The woman belongs to no one, least of all Hargrove. You know how this looks, Daniel. You know what folks are saying." "I don't give a damn what folks are saying." Bridger sighed, the sound of a man caught between duty and conscience. "Look, I know you're a good man, but you're making this hard on yourself, hard on her too." He glanced at Ayanna. "If you'd just let me take her to the reservation office, get her registered properly, this whole thing could blow over." "And what happens at the reservation office, Tom? They send her back to Sterling's estate as settlement for his debts. They sell her again." "No, that's not happening. Daniel, she stays here, free. End of discussion." One of Hargrove's men, a weasel-faced kid named Pike, spat into the snow. "You got no right keeping her, Mackenzie. Law says Indians need papers. She got papers." Daniel ignored him, kept his eyes on Bridger. "Is there an actual charge, Tom? Or are you just delivering Hargrove's messages now?" The sheriff's face reddened. "Don't push me, Daniel. I'm trying to help you here." "Then help by riding back to town and telling Hargrove to leave us alone." The two men stared at each other, old friends or as close to friends as the territory allowed, but friendship only stretched so far when law and power got involved. Finally, Bridger shook his head. "Can't do that, but I'm not taking her today either. Consider this a warning. Get your affairs in order, because Hargrove's not going to let this go." He wheeled his horse around and rode off, his two companions following. Their hoofbeats faded into the distance, swallowed by snow and wind. Daniel stood watching until they disappeared. Then he turned to find Ayanna looking at him with something new in her expression, not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of it. "They will come back," she said quietly. "I know. And next time, they will not just talk. I know that too. Then why do you fight for me? You do not know me. You owe me nothing." Daniel thought about that question, about Margaret dying in his arms, making him promise to fight for those who couldn't fight for themselves, about 4 years of existing without living, about a woman in an iron collar who refused to beg. "Because it's right," he said finally, "and because I'm tired of being a coward." "You are not a coward. I've been one for 4 years, hiding out here, letting the world go by, letting grief make me small." He met her eyes. "But you made me remember who I used to be. Before the war, before the fever. You made me remember what it means to stand up." Ayanna held his gaze for a long moment. Then slowly, deliberately, she reached out and placed her hand on his arm, just for a second, a gesture of acknowledgement, of gratitude, of something neither of them had words for yet. Then she turned and walked back into the cabin, leaving Daniel standing in the falling snow, feeling more alive than he had in years. That night, as darkness settled over the ranch, Daniel sat by the fire sharpening his knife. The rhythmic scrape of steel on whetstone filled the cabin with a sound both soothing and ominous, preparing for war while hoping for peace. Ayanna worked nearby, using needle and thread from Margaret's old sewing kit to mend tears in his coat. Her stitches were small and precise, the work of someone who understood that clothing meant survival in this climate. "Tell me about your wife," she said suddenly. Daniel's hands paused on the knife. "Why? Because she made you who you are, and I want to understand who that is." He considered refusing, considered saying the past was buried like the collar deep and gone, but something in Ayanna's voice, a genuine curiosity rather than idle gossip, made him set down the knife and speak. "Her name was Margaret. We met in Denver before the war. She was a nurse. I was young and stupid and thought I could save the world." A bitter smile touched his lips. "The war fixed that notion quick enough, but she waited for me. 3 years I was gone and she waited. When I came back with more scars than I'd left with, she married me anyway. She loved you. She did. God knows why." He stared into the fire. "We had 5 good years, built this ranch from nothing, had James our son, and then—" his throat tightened. "Scarlet fever came through one winter, took half the children in the county. Margaret nursed everyone she could, even when she started showing symptoms herself. She wouldn't stop, wouldn't rest. She was strong. She was stubborn. There's a difference." He picked up the knife again, but didn't resume sharpening, just held it, feeling the weight. "James got sick first. She stayed up 3 nights straight trying to break his fever. Then she collapsed. I couldn't save either of them. They died within a day of each other, and I just stopped. Stopped trying. Stopped caring. Stopped everything except breathing. Ayanna set down her sewing. But you did not stop completely. You are still here. That's not the same as living. No, but it is more than dying. They sat in silence, the truth of that hanging between them. More than dying. Less than living. The gray space where grief resided, where 4 years could pass in a blink and feel like forever at the same time. Your husband, Daniel said carefully. Your daughters. Will you tell me about them? Ayanna's hands stilled on the coat. For a moment he thought she wouldn't answer. Then quietly she began to speak. Takota was a hunter, the best in our band. He could track a deer for 3 days without losing the trail. Patient. Strong. He made me laugh. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. He would make faces at the children until they forgot to be afraid of storms. How did you meet? He brought meat to my mother after my father died. Every week for a year, never asking for anything, just providing. My mother told me he would make a good husband. She was right. And your daughters, the smile faded. Kaya was 6, curious about everything. She wanted to be a healer like my mother. Nayeli was 4. She was wild, brave. She feared nothing. Ayanna's voice cracked slightly. That is why she ran toward the soldiers instead of hiding. She thought she could fight them. Daniel closed his eyes. I'm sorry. Sorry does not bring them back. Sorry does not undo what was done. No, it doesn't. But still, Ayanna continued softer now, it is something to have someone acknowledge the loss, to not pretend it did not happen. They lapsed into silence again. Outside, wind howled around the cabin, rattling the shutters. The fire crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows on the walls. 2 people, 2 different lives, 2 different tragedies. But the same fundamental truth. They had survived when everything in them wanted to quit. And now, somehow they had to figure out what came after survival. Ayanna picked up the coat again, resumed her careful stitching. Daniel went back to sharpening his knife. Ordinary actions, simple domesticity, but underneath it all, an awareness that something had shifted. Some invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were 2 people learning to trust again. And in the Wyoming Territory in 1876, with winter closing in and enemies circling, trust was the most dangerous thing you could offer. It was also the only thing worth having. Late that night, after Ayanna had retired to her room and the cabin had grown quiet, Daniel stood at the window looking out at the snow-covered landscape. The storm had intensified wind, driving flakes horizontal across the yard. Visibility was maybe 20 feet. Beyond that, just white darkness. But at the very edge of that darkness, barely visible, Daniel thought he saw movement. A shape that might have been a man on horseback, or might have been nothing more than wind-sculpted snow and exhausted imagination. He watched for a long time, hand resting on his Colt. The shape, if it had been there at all, didn't reappear. But Daniel knew. Clayton Hargrove wasn't done. The sheriff's visit had been a courtesy, a final warning before things turned ugly. The real fight was coming. Daniel just hoped he was ready for it. In her room, Ayanna lay awake, listening to the storm. She had lived through Wyoming winters before, had survived worse cold, worse danger, but always with her people around her, with family, with the certainty that came from belonging somewhere. Now she belonged nowhere, was caught between worlds. Not white, not with her tribe, just a woman alone in a white man's cabin, dependent on his charity and hoping that charity didn't come with a price she couldn't pay. But when she thought about Daniel, about his careful hands removing the collar, about the way he'd let her choose whether to stay or go, she felt something unexpected. Not love, not yet, maybe not ever, but possibility. The possibility that not all white men were monsters, that some kept their promises, that maybe, just maybe she could build something new from the ashes of everything she'd lost. It was a fragile hope, easily crushed. But it was there, and for tonight, that was enough. Part 3. The Gathering Storm. 3 weeks passed like water flowing under ice, slow, quiet, deceptive in its calm. The ranch found its rhythm. Daniel woke before dawn each morning, splitting wood and tending to Ranger while frost painted the world silver. Ayanna rose with the sun, building fires with the efficiency of someone who'd learned that warmth meant survival. They worked side by side, repairing fence posts, the wood hard as iron in the frozen ground. They ate simple meals together, conversation sparse, but growing easier with each passing day. The silence between them changed. No longer the wary quiet of strangers, but something more comfortable. The silence of 2 people who didn't need words to understand each other. Daniel taught Ayanna to read English using his old Bible and newspapers from town yellowed and months out of date. She learned quickly, her finger tracing words with the same careful precision she brought to everything. Her spoken English improved too, the hesitation fading as her confidence grew. Within weeks, she spoke with only a slight accent, choosing her words with care, but no longer struggling to find them. When she stumbled over a word, he helped without condescension. When she succeeded, he simply nodded. No excess praise, just acknowledgement. In return, Ayanna taught him things his wife had never known. How to make poultices from pine bark that eased the ache in his war-damaged shoulder, how to read weather in the behavior of birds and the smell of wind, how to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks, a skill learned from necessity. She showed him the Apache way of cooking, transforming their meager supplies into meals that actually had flavor. Corn cakes made on hot stones. Stews thickened with ground acorns she'd gathered from the trees behind the barn. Small luxuries that made the cabin feel less like a place of exile and more like something approaching home. But it was the small moments that changed things between them. The morning Daniel found Ayanna had mended not just his coat, but every piece of clothing he owned, stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. The evening she came in from the cold to find he'd heated water so she could wash, a consideration no one had shown her in months. The night she woke screaming from nightmares, and he sat outside her door until dawn, not intruding, but letting her know she wasn't alone. Trust built itself one stone at a time, slowly, carefully, like everything worth having. On the 20th day, Daniel rode to town for supplies. He'd put it off as long as possible, knowing what waited there, but they needed flour and salt and lamp oil, things the ranch couldn't produce. Necessities that required money and civilization, both of which came with complications. Ayanna watched him saddle Ranger from the cabin doorway, wrapped in the blanket she'd taken to wearing like a shawl. "They will give you trouble," she said. "Probably." "Because of me." "No, because they're small-minded and mean-spirited. That's not your fault." She studied him for a long moment, dark eyes unreadable. "You could send me away. Make this easier for yourself." Daniel tightened the saddle cinch, testing it with a firm pull. "I could do a lot of things that would be easier. Doesn't mean they'd be right." He swung up into the saddle leather, creaking in the cold. "I'll be back before dark. Bar the door while I'm gone. Don't open it for anyone but me. I am not afraid." "I know, but humor me anyway." The ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Be careful, Daniel Mackenzie." It was the first time she'd used his full name. The sound of it in her accented English did something strange to his chest, made him feel seen in a way he hadn't since Margaret died. He nodded once and rode out, following the trail toward Broken Pine. The town looked exactly as it had 3 weeks ago. Same weathered buildings leaning against the wind, same mud churned to frozen ruts in the street, same faces peering out from behind windows, watching everything, judging everything. But something had changed. Daniel felt it the moment he rode down Main Street, an electricity in the air, a tension that made his hand drift toward his Colt without conscious thought. He tied Ranger outside Miller's general store and stepped inside. The warmth hit him first, then the smell of coffee and leather, and the indefinable scent of a store that sold everything from nails to candy. 3 customers browsed the aisles. All 3 stopped when Daniel entered, stared, then deliberately turned their backs. Harold Miller stood behind the counter, 50 years old, with a nervous disposition and hands that never stopped moving. He looked at Daniel with something like pity. "Daniel, Harold, need to settle my account and pick up some supplies." "Your money's no good here anymore." The words hung in the air like smoke. Daniel went very still. "Come again." Miller licked his lips, eyes darting to the other customers. "Mr. Hargrove came by. Said any merchant who serves you or that Apache woman would lose his business, all his business. And seeing as how Hargrove Mining employs most of this town, well." He spread his hands helplessly. "I got a family to feed, Daniel. You understand." "I understand you're letting Hargrove run your life." "Easy for you to say. You don't have 3 kids and a wife depending on you keeping this store open." Daniel felt anger rising hot in his throat. Not at Miller, really. The man was just doing what frightened men always did, choosing survival over principle. The anger was for Hargrove, for the system that let men like him rule through fear. "Fine," Daniel said quietly. "I'll take my business elsewhere." "There is nowhere else. Hargrove owns the other store too. Bought it last week." Of course he had. Clayton Hargrove played chess while everyone else was still learning checkers. 3 moves ahead, always. Daniel turned to leave, but a voice stopped him. "Wait." Ruth Morrison stepped out from behind a shelf of canned goods. She was a handsome woman in her early 50s, gray starting to thread through her dark hair. Her husband had died at Gettysburg, leaving her to raise their daughter Emma alone. She ran the boarding house at the edge of town, took no nonsense from anyone, and had a reputation for feeding strays and outcasts. She walked to the counter and set down a basket. "Put Mr. Mackenzie's supplies on my account, Harold." Miller's face went white. "Ruth, you can't. Hargrove said—" "I heard what Hargrove said, and I'm telling you to put this man's supplies on my account, unless you want to explain to the whole town why you're refusing service to a war veteran who never did a thing to harm anyone." The other customers had stopped pretending not to listen. One of them, a miner named Jack Sullivan, with an eye patch covering where he'd lost the left eye to a cave-in, stepped forward. "Put mine on Ruth's account too, Harold, and give Mackenzie whatever he needs. I'll cover the difference." Miller looked between them, sweating despite the cold. "Jack, you don't understand. Hargrove can go to hell," Jack said flatly. "I was at Shiloh with Daniel Mackenzie, watched him carry 3 wounded men off that field while bullets were flying thick as rain. Any man who'd turn his back on him over some scared-up Apache woman ain't worth the powder to blow him to hell." Ruth nodded. "Emma would be dead if not for that woman's medicine. You all heard about it. My girl was dying, fever burning her up. Dr. Walsh said there was nothing to be done. That woman, the one you're all so scared of, she came to my boarding house and sat with Emma for 3 days, made medicine from plants and roots, didn't ask for payment, didn't ask for thanks, just saved my daughter's life." Silence filled the store, the kind of silence that came when truth got spoken out loud and people had to decide whether to acknowledge it or pretend they hadn't heard. Finally, one of the other customers, an old farmer named Garrett, cleared his throat. "Ruth's right. My grandson had the croup last week, couldn't breathe, turning blue. I went to that ranch hat in hand, asking for help. The woman didn't hesitate. Gave me herbs, told me how to brew them. Boy's breathing fine now." The third customer, a young woman Daniel didn't recognize, spoke up quietly. "She helped me too. Women's trouble. Things I was too ashamed to tell Dr. Walsh about. She listened, didn't judge, fixed me up proper." Miller looked around at them, all his face a study in conflict. Fear of Hargrove on one side, shame and conscience on the other. "God damn it," he muttered. Then louder, all right, what do you need, Daniel?" Relief flooded through Daniel, unexpected and overwhelming. He'd gotten used to fighting alone, forgotten what it felt like to have people stand with him. "Flour, salt, lamp oil, coffee if you've got it." "I got it." While Miller gathered the supplies, Ruth moved to stand beside Daniel. She kept her voice low. "How is she really?" "Healing. Slowly. The bruises fading, but there's more than physical wounds to worry about." Ruth nodded. "Bring her to town sometime. Let people see she's not what Hargrove's been saying she is. Let them see she's just a woman who's been through hell and came out the other side." "I don't know if she's ready for that." "Maybe not, but when she is, you bring her to my place first. She'll be safe there." Daniel met her eyes, saw the steel beneath the kindness. Ruth Morrison had survived the loss of her husband, the judgment of a town that thought widows should remarry or disappear, and the constant struggle to keep her daughter fed. She knew something about fighting, losing battles. "Thank you," he said. "Don't thank me, just take care of her and yourself." Miller returned with the supplies wrapped in brown paper and tied with string. Daniel paid using the last of his cash reserves. The coins clinked on the counter, each one representing another week closer to having nothing. He gathered his purchases and turned to leave, but stopped when he saw who stood in the doorway. Dalton Hargrove, Clayton's son, 24 years old, with his father's arrogance and none of his intelligence. He'd been drinking. Daniel could smell the whiskey from 6 feet away. 2 of his friends flanked him, both looking for trouble. Well, Dalton said, his words slightly slurred. "If it ain't the Indian lover himself," Daniel kept his voice level. "Step aside, Dalton." "Or what? You'll shoot me like you shot those Confederates?" "Oh, wait, that was legal. This what you're doing now? Keeping that savage in your house? That's illegal. Least it will be soon as my father gets the judge to sign the papers. Your father can sign whatever he wants. Doesn't change anything." Dalton stepped fully into the store, blocking the exit. His friends spread out, cutting off other angles. Classic intimidation tactics, the kind young men with too much money and too little sense thought made them dangerous. "Here's what's going to happen," Dalton said. "You're going to hand over that Apache whore, and we're going to return her to where she belongs. Maybe sell her again, maybe keep her ourselves. Either way, she's not your concern anymore." The store went deathly quiet. Even Miller stopped moving. Daniel set down his supplies carefully. When he looked up, his eyes had gone cold. The kind of cold that came from killing men in war and learning that sometimes violence was the only language bullies understood. "Son," he said quietly, "you've got about 3 seconds to get out of my way before I put you on the ground. And your friends there, They can join you if they're feeling ambitious." Dalton laughed, but it sounded nervous. "You threatening me? You know who my father is. I know exactly who your father is. A coward who sends his boy to do his dirty work because he's too scared to face me himself." Dalton's face went red. He lunged forward, telegraphing the punch so obviously that Daniel had time to think about whether to dodge or block before deciding to do neither. He let Dalton's fist connect with his jaw. The impact snapped his head to the side, pain flaring white-hot through his skull. He tasted blood. But he didn't fall. Instead, he straightened slowly, turned back to face Dalton, and smiled. It was not a nice smile. "My turn," Daniel said. He moved fast, leveraging skills learned in too many bar fights and battlefield brawls. His fist caught Dalton in the solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs in an explosive gasp. As Dalton bent forward, Daniel brought his knee up, connecting with the younger man's face with a crunch that was probably a broken nose. Dalton went down hard, blood streaming from his nose, gasping like a landed fish. His two friends rushed forward. Daniel sidestepped the first one, stuck out his foot, and sent the man sprawling into a shelf of canned goods. They crashed to the floor in a cascade of tin and cursing. The second friend got smarter, or at least more cautious. He pulled a knife, 8 inches of steel, wicked and sharp. The store erupted in shouts, Miller yelling about his merchandise, Ruth screaming for someone to get the sheriff, Jack Sullivan moving forward to help, but too slow, too far away. Daniel's hand dropped to his Colt. The leather tie came undone with a practiced flick. The gun cleared leather, smooth as silk hammer, cocking back with a metallic click that cut through all other sounds. He didn't point it at the man with the knife, didn't need to, just held it loose and ready, the threat implicit. "You really want to die over this?" Daniel asked quietly. The man with the knife looked at the Colt, looked at Daniel's eyes, saw something there that made him reconsider his choices. The knife clattered to the floor. "Smart," Daniel said. He didn't holster the gun. Not yet. "Now pick up your friend and get out." They did, hauling Dalton to his feet and half carrying him toward the door. Blood dripped from Dalton's nose, leaving a trail of red drops on Miller's clean floor. At the threshold, Dalton turned back, hatred burning in his eyes. "You're dead," he spat, blood bubbling on his lips. "You and that savage both. My father's going to destroy you." "He's welcome to try." They left. The store exhaled collectively. Miller stood behind his counter, looking like he might faint. Ruth had gone pale, but stood her ground chin raised defiantly. Jack Sullivan started helping clean up the mess of canned goods. Daniel holstered his Colt and picked up his supplies. His jaw throbbed where Dalton had hit him, and he could feel it starting to swell. That was going to be colorful by morning. "I'm sorry about this, Harold," he said to Miller. The shopkeeper just shook his head, unable to find words. Daniel left the store and stepped into the cold afternoon. The confrontation had drawn a crowd. 20 people stood in the street watching. Some looked sympathetic, most looked afraid. Fear was contagious in small towns. He loaded his supplies onto Ranger, aware of every eye on him, aware that by tomorrow the story would have spread through Broken Pine like wildfire. Daniel Mackenzie beat Clayton Hargrove's son. War was coming. As he swung into the saddle, Sheriff Bridger emerged from his office down the street. He walked toward Daniel with the heavy tread of a man carrying the weight of impossible choices. "Daniel," he said when he got close enough, "I heard what happened. I defended myself, nothing more. That's not how Dalton's going to tell it. That's not how his father's going to hear it. I don't care how they hear it, Tom. I care about the truth." Bridger sighed. "The truth don't matter much when you're facing down Clayton Hargrove's money and influence. He's already talking to Judge Webb about getting an order. Says you're harboring an Indian without proper documentation. Says she's dangerous. She's about as dangerous as a church mouse. You know that. I know that. But the law's the law, and Hargrove knows how to use it." Daniel leaned forward in his saddle. "Then change the law. You're the sheriff. You're supposed to protect people, not serve the interests of rich men who think they own this town. It ain't that simple. It's exactly that simple. You just don't have the stones to do it." Bridger's face flushed. "You watch your mouth, Daniel. I'm still the law here." "Then act like it." They stared at each other, two men who'd once shared drinks and stories, now on opposite sides of a widening divide. Finally, Bridger stepped back. "Go home, Daniel, and think real hard about whether this is worth dying for." "I already have. The answer's yes." Daniel rode out of town, aware of Bridger watching him go, aware of the crowd dispersing, already spreading the news, aware that he'd just crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. War was coming, and he was ready. The ride back to the ranch took 2 hours. The sun was low in the sky by the time Daniel crested the final hill and saw his cabin in the valley below. Smoke rose from the chimney, a thin gray line against the darkening sky. A light glowed in the window, small signs of habitation that made something in his chest tighten. Home. He hadn't thought of this place as home in years. It had been a tomb, a place to wait out the rest of his days in solitary penance. But now, with Ayanna there, it had become something else, something worth fighting for. He was still 100 yards out when he saw her emerge from the cabin. She stood on the porch hand, shading her eyes against the setting sun, watching him approach. Even from this distance he could see the tension in her posture. She'd been worried. The realization struck him hard. Someone had been worried about him. For the first time in 4 years, his safe return mattered to another living soul. He rode into the yard and dismounted. Ayanna came down the steps to meet him, her eyes going immediately to his swollen jaw. "You fought," she said. Not a question. Dalton Hargrove decided to make it personal. "Did you kill him?" "No, just educated him on the consequences of poor decisions." The corner of her mouth twitched, almost a smile. "Good. The dead cannot learn." She helped him unload the supplies, and together they carried everything inside. The cabin was warm, the fire built up high. Something was cooking in the pot over the fire, filling the air with the smell of venison and herbs. "You hunted?" Daniel asked, surprised. "I set a snare this morning. A rabbit came. Then I traded the rabbit skin to a passing trapper for venison." She said it matter-of-factly, as if everyone could turn a morning's work into an evening's meal through sheer resourcefulness. Daniel shook his head in wonder. "You're full of surprises." "I am Apache. We survive." They ate dinner in comfortable silence, but Daniel could feel Ayanna watching him, studying the bruise forming on his jaw, the split in his lip. Finally, she set down her bowl. "This will get worse," she said. "I know. Hargrove will not stop. I know that too." "Then why do you continue? You could send me away, to the reservation. I would go. It would be safer for you." Daniel met her eyes across the table. In the firelight they looked like dark water, deep and fathomless. "Do you want to go?" She hesitated, just for a moment, but in that hesitation, Daniel saw the truth. She didn't want to leave. This cabin, this small, rough place, had become something to her, too. A refuge, maybe even a home. "No," she said finally, "I do not want to go." "Then you stay, and we deal with whatever comes together." "Together?" she repeated softly, testing the word. Then, "Daniel Mackenzie, you are either very brave or very foolish. Can't it be both?" This time she did smile. A real smile, small but genuine, that transformed her face from merely pretty to something approaching beautiful. It lasted only a second before fading, but Daniel found himself wanting to see it again, wanting to give her reasons to smile instead of reasons to fear. After dinner, Ayanna tended to his injuries with the same careful efficiency she brought to everything. She made a poultice of herbs that smelled sharp and medicinal, spreading it gently on his swollen jaw. Her fingers were cool against his heated skin. "This will reduce the swelling," she said, "and help prevent infection. Where did you learn all this?" "My mother. She was a healer. Learned from her mother, who learned from hers. Knowledge passed down through generations." Her voice grew softer. "I was teaching my daughters, Kaya especially. She had the gift, gentle hands and a patient heart." Daniel heard the pain beneath the words. The loss that never really healed just became something you learned to carry. She would be proud of you, using what she learned to help others. Perhaps, or perhaps she would say, "I should have died with them. That survival without family is not truly survival at all." "Do you believe that?" Ayanna was quiet for a long time, her fingers still working the poultice into his skin. "I did," she said finally. "For many months after they died, I believed I should have died too. When Sterling bought me, I hoped he would kill me, end it, but he did not. And then you came. And you gave me a choice, live or go, stay or leave, the first choice anyone had given me since that day." "What made you choose to live?" "You did. You removed the collar, you buried it. You treated me as human when everyone else saw only a thing to be owned or despised." She finished with the poultice and stepped back. "You reminded me that there are still good men in this world, and if there are good men, then perhaps there are good things worth living for." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Daniel didn't know what to say, didn't trust himself to speak without revealing the feelings that had begun growing in him, unexpected and unwanted but undeniable. He was falling in love with her, or maybe had already fallen. Somewhere between removing the collar and teaching her to read. Somewhere between shared meals and comfortable silences. It had happened so gradually he hadn't noticed until it was already done. But he couldn't tell her that. She'd been through too much, suffered too many violations of body and soul. She needed safety now, not the burden of a man's affection. So he swallowed the words and simply nodded. "Thank you," he said, "for the medicine and for staying. Where else would I go?" It was meant as a light comment, maybe even a joke, but they both heard the truth beneath it. She had nowhere else, no family, no tribe willing to take back a woman who'd been owned by white men, no place in either world, white or Apache, except here, in this small cabin with a man who'd bought her freedom for $8 and asked nothing in return. That night, long after Ayanna had gone to bed, Daniel sat by the fire cleaning his Colt. The ritual was soothing, familiar. Remove the cylinder, check each chamber, clean the barrel, oil the action, reassemble, load. He'd learned the ritual in the war, performed it 1,000 times in camps and trenches. Back then, it had been necessity. Now it felt like preparation, because Sheriff Bridger had been right about one thing. This was worth dying for, not the ranch, not even his own pride or honor. But Ayanna, her right to exist without being owned, her right to heal and grow and maybe someday smile without the weight of trauma pulling it back down. That was worth dying for. That was worth everything. Outside, the wind picked up, howling around the cabin like a wolf circling prey. Storm coming. Daniel could feel it in his bones and the old wound in his shoulder that ached when the weather turned. But this storm wasn't just weather. It was human and deliberate and coming fast. Clayton Hargrove wouldn't wait much longer. The beating Daniel had given his son demanded a response, and men like Hargrove didn't respond with half measures. Daniel finished with the Colt and loaded it 6 rounds in the cylinder hammer, resting on an empty chamber for safety. He set it on the table within easy reach. Then he stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkness. Somewhere out there in the town or at Hargrove's estate plans were being made. Forces were gathering. The last stand was coming. And Daniel Mackenzie, for the first time in 4 years, felt truly alive. Part 4. Fight for what's right. The summons came 3 days after Christmas. Daniel had been splitting wood behind the cabin when he heard hoofbeats. Not the hurried pace of trouble, but the steady rhythm of official business. He set down the axe and wiped sweat from his forehead despite the cold, his breath steaming in the winter air. Sheriff Bridger rode into the yard alone this time. No deputies or hired guns flanking him. That was something, at least. A small mercy. He sat heavy in the saddle, a man who'd aged 10 years in the past month. "Tom," Daniel said by way of greeting. Bridger dismounted slowly like his bones hurt. He pulled a folded paper from inside his coat and held it out. His hand shook slightly, whether from cold or conscience, Daniel couldn't tell. "This is from Judge Webb. You're ordered to appear before him on January 5th. That's a week from today." Daniel took the paper, but didn't open it. "What are the charges?" "Violation of the Indian Appropriation Act. Harboring an Indian without proper documentation. Interfering with legal commerce." Bridger paused. "And assault. Dalton's pressing charges for what happened at the store. Self-defense. That'll be for the judge to decide." Daniel finally unfolded the paper, scanning the legal language that boiled down to one simple truth. They were coming for Ayanna, using the law as a weapon just as he'd known they would. "And if I don't appear, then I'll have to come back with a warrant and deputies, and it won't be pleasant for anyone." Bridger met his eyes. "Don't make me do that, Daniel, please." Behind Daniel, the cabin door opened. Ayanna stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cold. She took in the scene immediately, her expression going carefully neutral. Bridger touched his hat. "Ma'am." She didn't respond, just looked at Daniel, a silent question in her eyes. "It's a court summons," Daniel said. "Judge wants to see us next week. To take me away. To try." Ayanna's jaw tightened, but she showed no other reaction. She'd survived worse than court proceedings. Had survived things that would have broken most people. A corrupt judge was just another trial in a life that had been nothing but trials. "I will go," she said simply. "The hell you will," Daniel replied, "not without a fight." Bridger shifted uncomfortably. "Daniel, you can't fight the law." "Watch me." The sheriff sighed deeply, a sound of complete defeat. "I brought the summons. What you do with it is your choice, but know this. Clayton Hargrove has bought and paid for Judge Webb's ruling. The outcome's already decided. You show up, you lose. You don't show up, I have to arrest you. Either way, he wins. Unless we find another option." "There is no other option." "There's always another option," Daniel said. But even as he spoke the words, he felt the weight of their futility. Bridger was right. The system was rigged. The game was fixed. Men like Hargrove didn't play fair because they didn't have to. After Bridger left, Daniel stood in the yard holding the summons, feeling the walls closing in. 4 years of grief had taught him how to endure, but it hadn't taught him how to win against an enemy who controlled the very rules of engagement. Ayanna came down from the porch and stood beside him. She didn't touch him, but her presence was a comfort anyway. "There is a way," she said quietly. "What way?" "Marriage." The word hit him like a fist. He turned to stare at her, trying to read her expression. But she'd gone back to that careful neutrality, the mask she wore when she didn't want the world to see what she was feeling. "What are you talking about? If I marry an American citizen, I become a citizen. The law cannot touch me then." She said it matter-of-factly, like discussing the weather. "I heard Ruth Morrison talking about it when I went to help her daughter. A woman at the reservation married a white trapper, and she was granted citizenship." Daniel's mind raced. She was right. The law had loopholes, and this was one of them. An Indian woman married to a white citizen could claim citizenship through her husband. It wasn't guaranteed, but it was possible. More possible than winning a rigged court case. But marriage. The word carried weight, implied things, demanded things. "Ayanna," he said carefully, "marriage is not something to enter into lightly." "I know what marriage is." "Do you?" "Because I'm not talking about a legal arrangement. I'm talking about vows. Commitment. Being bound to another person for the rest of your life." "I was married before. I understand. To a man you loved. To a man you chose. This would be different." She finally looked at him, really looked at him, and something flickered in her dark eyes. Something he couldn't quite name. "Would it be so terrible being bound to me?" "That's not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" Daniel struggled for words. How could he explain that he'd already fallen in love with her? That the thought of marrying her filled him with equal parts hope and terror. That he wanted her to choose him, not out of necessity, but out of desire. "I mean, you deserve better than a marriage of convenience. You deserve to be loved, to be chosen, not to feel trapped into something because the law leaves you no other choice." Ayanna was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "And if I told you I was choosing, not because I have no other option, but because I have seen who you are, because you removed my collar and treated me as human when no one else would, because you make me feel safe in a world that has shown me nothing but cruelty." Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs. "Ayanna, I am not asking you to love me, Daniel Mackenzie. I know your heart still belongs to your wife. I am only asking you to let me stay, to give me a name that the law cannot take away. If that requires marriage, then I am willing." He wanted to tell her his heart didn't belong to Margaret anymore, that grief had released its grip somewhere along the way, that when he thought about the future now he saw Ayanna in it, saw her smile, her strength, her quiet competence, saw a life worth living instead of just enduring. But the words stuck in his throat. Because what if she didn't feel the same? What if she truly did see this as nothing more than a legal necessity? He couldn't burden her with his feelings when she'd already carried so much. "All right," he said finally. "If that's what you want, we'll do it, but not because you have to, because you're choosing to." "I am choosing, and you can unchoose, any time. If you change your mind, if you want to leave the doors open, always." Something soft entered her expression. "You would let me go, even after marriage. Your freedom is not mine to give or take. It's yours. Has been from the moment I cut that collar off." Ayanna stepped closer, close enough that he could smell the sage she used to wash her hair, close enough to see the faint scar on her temple where the wound had healed, close enough that when she reached up and touched his face, her fingers were warm against his cold skin. "Then I choose to stay," she said, "and I choose you." Before Daniel could respond, before he could process what was happening, she rose up on her toes and kissed him, soft, brief, a whisper of contact that nevertheless sent electricity racing through his entire body. She pulled back before he could react, her cheeks flushed, eyes bright with something that might have been nervousness or might have been hope. "Was that appropriate?" she asked. "Ruth said that engaged people kiss, but I do not know white customs well." Daniel's brain had stopped working. His lips still tingled where she'd touched them. His hands trembled slightly as he held the ring. He felt like he was 17 again, fumbling and overwhelmed and entirely out of his depth. "That was—" He managed, then stopped, cleared his throat, tried again. "That was more than appropriate. That was perfect." Now she definitely looked nervous. "I have not kissed anyone since Dakota. I do not know if I did it correctly." "You did it exactly right." They stood in the cold snow beginning to fall around them, two damaged people trying to figure out how to be whole again, trying to build something new from the ruins of everything they'd lost. "We should go see Reverend Hayes," Daniel said finally. "Make it official before the court date." Ayanna nodded. "When?" "Tomorrow. No point waiting. And the sooner we're married, the stronger our legal position." "All right." They went inside to warm up, but something had changed between them. An invisible line had been crossed. They were no longer just two people sharing a space. They were something more. Something that didn't have a name yet, but felt like possibility. That evening, Daniel rode to town alone. He needed to talk to someone, and Reverend Hayes was the only man he trusted to understand the situation without judgment. He found the Reverend in his small house behind the church, reading by lamplight. Hayes looked up when Daniel knocked, surprise flickering across his weathered face. "Daniel, come in, come in. What brings you out on a night like this?" Daniel stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. He got straight to the point, explaining the summons, the plan, the proposal. Hayes listened without interrupting, his expression growing more thoughtful with each word. When Daniel finished, the old man sat back in his chair. "So you want to marry her?" "Yes." "Because you love her, or because it's legally convenient?" Daniel opened his mouth to say the convenient part, then stopped. Because that would be a lie. And he'd never lied to Hayes, not in all the years they'd known each other. "Both," he admitted. "I love her. I don't know when it happened, but it did. But I also know she's doing this to survive, not because she feels the same way. So I guess I'm asking you to perform a ceremony that's going to be one-sided." "Is that even allowed?" Hayes smiled, a gentle expression full of understanding. "Son, I've married dozens of couples in my 40 years as a minister, and I can tell you this. Most of them started one-sided. Love grows over time if you tend it properly. The question isn't whether she loves you now. The question is whether you're willing to wait until she does. I'd wait forever." "That's what I thought." Hayes stood pulling his Bible from the shelf. "I'll marry you tomorrow at noon. No fancy ceremony, no witnesses beyond those required by law. Just you, her God, and the promise you're making." "Thank you, Reverend." "Don't thank me yet. Marriage is hard work even under the best circumstances, and your circumstances are about as far from best as I can imagine. You're going to face opposition from all sides. Hargrove won't accept this quietly. The town will gossip. The judge might try to find a way around it. I know. But you're doing it anyway." "Yes." Hayes nodded slowly. "Then you have my blessing, and my prayer that God gives you the strength for what's coming." Daniel rode home through falling snow, his mind churning. Tomorrow he would marry Ayanna, would stand before God and man and pledge himself to her. It should have terrified him, should have felt like betraying Margaret's memory, but it didn't. It felt right, like a door opening after years of being locked, like possibility after nothing but endings. When he got back to the cabin, Ayanna was asleep, or pretending to be. He couldn't tell which. He sat by the fire for a long time, thinking about vows and promises and the strange path his life had taken. 4 years ago, he'd buried his wife and son and decided he was done living, just waiting for death to catch up. But death hadn't come. Instead, a woman in an iron collar had arrived, and she'd reminded him that survival wasn't the same as surrender, that choosing to live, really live, was the bravest thing a person could do. Tomorrow they would marry, and whatever came after, they would face it together. The word echoed in his mind as he finally lay down to sleep. Together. The next morning dawned clear and bitterly cold. Daniel woke early, his stomach tight with nervousness. He'd been married before, knew what to expect from the ceremony itself. But this felt different, more weighted, like standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Ayanna was already up, braiding her long, dark hair with careful precision. She'd washed and put on the cleanest dress she owned, a simple gray thing that Ruth Morrison had given her. It hung loose on her frame, but she'd belted it with a strip of leather to give it some shape. She looked beautiful, not in the painted, perfumed way of society women, but in the way of something wild and genuine, like a mountain stream or a hawk in flight. Beautiful because she was herself, unadorned and honest. "Are you ready?" Daniel asked. "Are you? Honestly, I'm terrified." That surprised a small smile from her. "Good. I would worry if you were not afraid. Fear means this matters." They rode to town together, Ayanna sitting behind Daniel on Ranger. The horse seemed to sense the importance of the day, moving with unusual care. The ride took an hour silent except for the sound of hooves crunching through snow. Broken Pine looked the same as always. Weathered buildings, muddy streets, people going about their business with hunched shoulders against the cold. But Daniel felt every eye on them as they rode through, felt the weight of judgment and curiosity. Let them look, let them gossip. After today, it wouldn't matter. Ayanna would have protection that even Hargrove couldn't easily strip away. Reverend Hayes was waiting at the church, along with Ruth Morrison and Jack Sullivan. They'd come to serve as witnesses, Hayes explained. The law required 2. "You sure about this, Daniel?" Jack asked quietly while Hayes prepared. "More sure than I've been about anything in years." "Then let's get you married." The ceremony was brief. No music, no flowers, no crowd of well-wishers, just 5 people standing in a small church that smelled of old wood and candle wax. Hayes read from his Bible, the familiar words of the marriage service echoing in the cold air. Daniel barely heard them. All his attention was on Ayanna standing beside him, her hand small and warm in his. "Do you, Daniel James Mackenzie, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife? To have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Daniel's throat was tight. He thought about Margaret, about the vows he'd made to her 17 years ago, wondered if she would approve of this. Then he heard her voice in his memory clear as day. "Don't let your conscience borrow trouble. It cannot repay." "I do," he said. Hayes turned to Ayanna. "And do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband, to have and to hold from this day forward, for better or worse, for richer or poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish till death do you part?" Ayanna looked up at Daniel. Her eyes were bright, whether with tears or hope he couldn't tell. "I do." "Then by the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Daniel, you may kiss your bride." This was it, the moment that would seal everything. Daniel leaned down slowly, giving Ayanna every chance to pull away. She didn't. Instead, she rose to meet him, and their lips touched in a kiss that was gentle and tentative and full of promise. When they pulled apart, Ruth was wiping her eyes. Jack was grinning. Hayes looked satisfied. "Congratulations," the Reverend said. "May God bless your union and give you strength for the road ahead." They signed the marriage certificate, Ruth and Jack adding their signatures as witnesses. Hayes filled in the date. January 4th, 1877. The ink was still wet when Daniel folded the paper carefully and tucked it into his coat. This was their armor now, this piece of paper and the vows they'd spoken. Not much to stand against Clayton Hargrove's money and influence, but it was something. It was hope. Outside the church, Ruth hugged Ayanna tightly. "You take care of each other," she said. "And if you need anything at all, you come find me." "Thank you," Ayanna said softly, "for everything." Jack shook Daniel's hand. "I meant what I said before. You need help, you call on me. I still remember how to shoot straight." "I hope it doesn't come to that." "So do I. But hoping and preparing are 2 different things." Daniel and Ayanna rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon, the winter sun already beginning its descent toward the mountains. Neither spoke much, but there was a new awareness between them, a sense that something fundamental had shifted. They were married now, husband and wife, bound together by law and God and their own choices, for better or worse. When they arrived home, Daniel helped Ayanna down from the horse. His hands lingered on her waist, perhaps a moment longer than necessary. She didn't pull away. "So," Daniel said, suddenly awkward, "I suppose we should discuss sleeping arrangements." Ayanna raised an eyebrow. "We are married now. Is it not customary for married people to share a bed?" "Yes, but I don't want to assume. If you'd rather keep separate rooms, that's fine. This marriage can be whatever you need it to be." She studied him for a long moment. Then, with deliberate care, she reached up and touched his face. "I did not marry you to sleep alone, Daniel Mackenzie." His breath caught. "You're sure?" "I am sure." That night they held each other in the darkness, listening to the wind howl outside. No words needed, just presence, just the quiet understanding that they'd chosen each other, not out of desperation, but out of hope. "Thank you," Ayanna whispered against his chest, "for choosing me." Daniel tightened his arms around her. "Thank you for choosing me back." In the warmth of that small cabin, 2 broken souls began the slow work of becoming whole. Outside, the Wyoming night pressed close. Somewhere in town, Clayton Hargrove was plotting. Judge Webb was preparing his courtroom. Forces were gathering for the confrontation that was coming. But for tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight there was only Daniel and Ayanna, husband and wife, facing an uncertain future with the only certainty that mattered. They had each other, and that would have to be enough. Part 5. The Last Stand. The courthouse summons sat on the table like a coiled snake. January 5th, tomorrow. Daniel stared at it while sharpening his knife, the rhythmic scrape of steel on whetstone filling the cabin with ominous music. Ayanna moved quietly around the kitchen preparing supper. They'd been married for 24 hours, but the weight of what was coming pressed down on their brief happiness like a stone. "We could run," she said, suddenly breaking the silence. Daniel looked up. "What? We could leave tonight, ride west to California or north to Canada. Disappear where Hargrove cannot reach us. That would make me a fugitive. You too. Better a fugitive than dead. Daniel set down the knife and whetstone, crossed to where she stood by the stove. He took her hands in his, feeling how cold they were despite the heat from cooking. I spent 4 years running from life, he said quietly. Hiding here, letting the world pass me by. I'm done running. Whatever happens tomorrow, we face it standing up, even if it means losing. Even then, because some things are worth losing for. Ayanna searched his face looking for doubt or fear. She found only determination. After a moment she nodded. Then we stand together. Together. They ate dinner in tense silence. Venison stew that Ayanna had spent all afternoon preparing, rich with herbs and root vegetables. It was delicious, but Daniel could barely taste it. His mind was already in that courtroom running through scenarios calculating odds. None of them were good. After supper, there was a knock at the door. Sharp. Urgent. Daniel's hand went immediately to his Colt. He moved to the window and looked out. Jack Sullivan stood on the porch along with 3 other men Daniel recognized. All of them were armed. Daniel opened the door cautiously. Jack, we need to talk. Can we come in? Daniel glanced at Ayanna. She nodded. He stepped back, letting the 4 men enter. They filed in, bringing cold air and the smell of horses. Besides Jack, there was Tom Crawford, a rancher from the next valley over, Marcus Webb, no relation to the judge who worked as a blacksmith, and young Samuel Garrett, barely 20, whose grandfather Ayanna had helped. What's this about? Daniel asked. Jack spoke first. We heard about tomorrow, about Hargrove trying to use the court to take your wife. Word travels fast. It does in small towns, especially when rich men are abusing power. Jack paused. We're here to offer our support. All of us have reasons to stand against Hargrove. Tom lost his water rights when Hargrove bought the land upstream. Marcus has been trying to unionize the miners, and Hargrove's been threatening him. Samuel's family owes their lives to your wife. Tom Crawford spoke up, his voice gruff. Point is, Hargrove's been pushing folks around for too long, using his money and influence like a club. We're tired of it. And you think standing with me will change that? Daniel asked. Maybe, maybe not, but at least we'll have tried. Daniel felt something loosen in his chest. He'd been prepared to face this alone, had accepted it. But having allies, having people willing to stand beside him, that changed the equation. I appreciate this, he said, more than you know. But you understand what you're risking. Hargrove doesn't forgive. He doesn't forget. If you stand with me tomorrow, you make him your enemy. Marcus smiled grimly. He's already our enemy. We're just finally doing something about it. They talked for another hour, making plans. Not strategies for the courtroom where the outcome was already decided, but preparations for what might come after. Because none of them believed Judge Webb would rule fairly, and none of them believed Hargrove would accept the marriage certificate without a fight. If he sends men to the ranch, Jack said, you'll need backup. I'll position myself in the tree line. Tom, you take the north ridge, Marcus the south approach. Samuel, you're the youngest and fastest. You ride circuit, keep watch, raise the alarm if you see trouble. Daniel started to protest, but Jack cut him off. You saved my life at Shiloh, Daniel. Carried me 3 miles with a bullet in your own leg. I've owed you for 15 years. Let me pay that debt. You don't owe me anything? The hell I don't. Besides, this ain't just about you anymore. It's about whether men like Hargrove get to run roughshod over decent folks just because they've got money. It's about drawing a line. After they left, Daniel stood at the window watching their silhouettes disappear into the darkness. Ayanna came to stand beside him, her reflection ghostly in the glass. You have good friends, she said. I didn't know I still did. Thought I'd pushed everyone away. People remember kindness. They remember courage. She leaned against his arm, and they recognize worth fighting for when they see it. That night they lay in bed holding each other, neither sleeping. The hours crawled by with agonizing slowness. Outside the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Storm coming. Daniel could feel it in his bones. At 3 in the morning, Ayanna finally spoke into the darkness. Daniel, yeah, if something happens tomorrow, if they take me, they won't. But if they do, I want you to know that these past weeks they have been the happiest of my life since my family died. You gave me hope when I had none. You gave me a reason to keep living. Whatever happens, that matters. You matter. Daniel pulled her closer, feeling the fragility of her body against his, the strength of her spirit radiating through. Nothing's going to happen. I won't let them take you, I promise. Some promises are beyond our power to keep. Then I'll break the laws of heaven and earth, keeping this one. She kissed him then, desperate and fierce, and they made love like it was the last time, like the world might end with the sunrise. And when they finally fell asleep in the gray hour before dawn, it was with the knowledge that everything could change in the next few hours. Everything probably would. Dawn came too quickly. Daniel woke to find Ayanna already up dressed in the gray dress Ruth had given her. She'd braided her hair, carefully woven it with a strip of leather. She looked composed, ready, but Daniel could see the tension in her shoulders. They ate a silent breakfast. Neither hungry, both forcing down food because the day ahead would require strength. Daniel checked his Colt twice, made sure every chamber was loaded, strapped on his gun belt, and felt the familiar weight settle on his hip. "Do you think there will be violence?" Ayanna asked, watching him. "I think Hargrove will do whatever it takes to win, and if the law fails him, he'll turn to other methods." "Then we should be prepared." She disappeared into the bedroom and emerged carrying something wrapped in cloth. When she unwrapped it, Daniel's eyes widened. A knife. Apache made the blade obsidian and deadly sharp, the handle wrapped in leather. "I hid this when they captured me," she said. "It belonged to Dakota. I have carried it since the day he died." "You know how to use it." "I am Apache. Of course I know how to use it." There was steel in her voice, a reminder that she was not fragile despite everything she'd endured. She was a survivor, a fighter, and she would not go quietly if they tried to take her. They rode to town together, arriving just before 9. The courthouse was a 2-story brick building at the center of Broken Pine, imposing and official. A crowd had already gathered on the steps. Curious townspeople, Hargrove's men, a few faces that might have been friendly. As Daniel and Ayanna dismounted, Clayton Hargrove emerged from the crowd. He wore an expensive suit, hair slicked back, expression smug. Behind him stood his son Dalton, nose still crooked from where Daniel had broken it, eyes burning with hatred. "Mackenzie," Hargrove said pleasantly, "I'm surprised you showed up. Thought you might have run like a coward." "I'm not running from anything." "Good. Then this will be quick." Hargrove's eyes slid to Ayanna with open contempt. "Enjoy your last few hours of freedom, girl. By noon you'll be property of the state. And I've already arranged to purchase you at the auction." Ayanna met his gaze without flinching. "I am not property. I am a citizen." "You're a savage, and you'll learn your place soon enough." Daniel stepped between them, his hand resting on his Colt. "You touch her, Hargrove, and it'll be the last thing you do." "That a threat? That's a promise." Sheriff Bridger pushed through the crowd, his face haggard. "That's enough. Daniel, Ayanna, you need to come inside. Court's about to start." The courtroom was small and stuffy, heated by a single wood stove that couldn't quite keep up with the cold. Judge Cornelius Webb sat behind the bench, a fat man with shrewd eyes and hands that trembled slightly. Bought and paid for, Daniel thought. Hargrove's man through and through. They sat at the defendant's table. No lawyer. Daniel had tried to find one, but every attorney in the territory had either been bought off or threatened. They were alone in this, almost alone. The door opened and Reverend Hayes walked in, followed by Ruth Morrison and Dr. Henry Walsh. They took seats in the gallery, a small showing of support. Not much, but something. Judge Webb banged his gavel. "Court is now in session. Case of the territory versus Daniel Mackenzie and the Apache woman known as Ayanna. Mr. Hargrove, you're bringing the complaint. State your case." Hargrove stood playing to the crowd. "Your Honor, the facts are simple. Mr. Mackenzie is harboring an Indian without proper documentation in direct violation of the Indian Appropriation Act of 1871. Furthermore, this woman is dangerous. She's Apache. Her people have killed settlers, burned homesteads. Allowing her to live freely among decent Christian folk is a threat to public safety." "That's a lie," Daniel said, standing. Webb banged his gavel. "You'll have your turn, Mr. Mackenzie. Sit down." "I have documentation," Daniel continued, ignoring the order. He pulled the marriage certificate from his coat and held it up. "We were married 2 days ago by Reverend Hayes. Under territorial law, she's now a citizen through marriage. Your court has no jurisdiction." The courtroom erupted in whispers. Hargrove's face went red, then white. Webb looked like he'd swallowed something sour. "Let me see that," the judge demanded. Daniel brought the certificate forward. Webb examined it, looking for any flaw, any excuse to dismiss it. But Hayes had filled it out perfectly. Every line complete, every signature witnessed, completely legal. "This changes nothing," Webb said finally. "The marriage could be fraudulent, entered into solely to circumvent the law." "It's a legal marriage," Daniel said, "recognized by the church and the territory. I'll be the judge of what's legal in my courtroom." Webb leaned back in his chair. "I'm ordering an investigation into the validity of this marriage. Until that investigation is complete, the woman will be held in custody." "On what grounds?" "On the grounds that I say so. Sheriff Bridger, take her into custody." The sheriff stood slowly, reluctance written in every line of his body. But he was a man who followed orders even when they made him sick. He moved toward Ayanna. Daniel's hand dropped to his Colt. The courtroom froze. every eye fixed on that hand, on the weapon, on the terrible moment balanced on a knife's edge. "Don't do this, Daniel," Bridger said quietly. "Please. I made a promise. I won't let them take her. You draw that gun, you become an outlaw. There's no coming back from that." "Then I guess I'm an outlaw." Reverend Hayes stood. "Your Honor, I performed that marriage. It was done in good faith with full legal standing. You cannot simply dismiss it because it's inconvenient for Mr. Hargrove. I can do whatever I deem necessary for justice and public safety. This isn't justice. This is corruption." Webb's face purpled. "You want to be held in contempt, Reverend. I want to see you do what's right." Before Webb could respond, the courtroom door burst open. Jack Sullivan stood there along with Tom Crawford, Marcus Webb, and Samuel Garrett, all armed, all ready. "Nobody's taking that woman anywhere," Jack said flatly. The room erupted, people shouting, some running for the exits, Hargrove's men reaching for their weapons, everything spiraling toward violence with terrifying speed. And then a new voice cut through the chaos. "Enough!" Everyone turned. A man stood in the doorway behind Jack and the others. Tall, dignified, wearing the uniform of a U.S. Marshal. He had iron-gray hair and eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by small-town corruption. "I'm Marshal William Grant out of Cheyenne," he announced, his voice carrying authority. "And I have a federal warrant that supersedes this proceeding." He walked down the aisle and handed papers to Judge Webb. The judge read them, his face going from red to ashen. "What is this?" Hargrove demanded. Marshal Grant turned to him. "This is a warrant for your arrest, Mr. Hargrove, on charges of bribery, corruption, and conspiracy to deprive a citizen of their civil rights. It seems someone's been writing letters to the territorial governor about your activities. Very detailed letters." Hargrove looked around wildly. "This is absurd. I'm a respected businessman." "You're a criminal who's been hiding behind money and influence for too long." Grant nodded to his two deputies who'd entered behind him. "Take him." As the deputies moved to arrest Hargrove, Clayton turned his fury on Daniel. You did this. You wrote those letters." "Actually," Ruth Morrison said, standing, "I did, along with about 20 other people you've wronged over the years. We documented everything, every bribe, every threat, every abuse of power, and we sent it all to the governor's office." Hargrove lunged toward her, but the deputies grabbed him. He struggled, screaming threats and curses, but they hauled him toward the door. Dalton Hargrove watched his father being arrested, his face twisted with rage. He turned that rage on Daniel. "This isn't over," he hissed. Then he pushed through the crowd and disappeared. Marshal Grant turned to Judge Webb. "As for you, Your Honor, you're being relieved of your duties pending a full investigation. I suggest you cooperate fully." Webb looked like he might faint. He simply nodded, unable to speak. The marshal finally addressed Daniel and Ayanna. "Your marriage is legal and recognized. No one has the authority to separate you or question Mrs. Mackenzie's citizenship. You're free to go." The courtroom had gone silent. Then slowly applause started, first from Ruth, then from the others who'd supported Daniel, then from townspeople who'd been too afraid to speak up before, but now found their courage. Daniel pulled Ayanna close, hardly able to believe it. They'd won. Against all odds, against corruption and power and hate, they'd actually won. "It's over," he whispered into her hair. "Is it?" she asked softly. And in that moment, Daniel saw movement through the courtroom window. Dalton Hargrove mounting a horse, looking back at the courthouse with murder in his eyes. No, it wasn't over. Not yet. "We need to get home," Daniel said. "Now." They pushed through the celebrating crowd and ran for their horses. Jack and the others followed, sensing trouble. They rode hard through the streets of Broken Pine, people scattering out of their way. Daniel's mind raced. Dalton had left before them, had a head start, and the young fool was angry enough to do something stupid, something violent. They were still 2 miles from the ranch when they saw the smoke, black and thick, rising into the clear winter sky like a beacon of destruction. Daniel's heart dropped into his stomach. He kicked Ranger into a full gallop, Ayanna clinging to him, both of them praying they weren't too late. The ranch came into view. The barn was an inferno, flames shooting 50 feet into the air. The cabin's roof was on fire, smoke pouring from the windows, and standing in front of it all, torch in hand and madness in his eyes, was Dalton Hargrove. He wasn't alone. Victor Kane stood beside him, along with 3 other hired guns, all armed, all waiting. Daniel reined in Ranger 50 yards out. The others spread out behind him, forming a line, 5 against 5. The numbers were even, but the stakes were everything. "Dalton," Daniel called, "don't do this. Your father's already going to prison. Don't join him." "My father's going to prison because of you," Dalton screamed. "You destroyed everything, our reputation, our business, our name, all for some Apache whore," She's my wife, and what your father did he brought on himself. I'm going to kill you, Mackenzie, going to burn everything you love and then put a bullet in your head. And then I'm going to take that woman and make her wish she'd died with her savage family." Ayanna's hand tightened on Daniel's arm. He felt her anger, her fear, her determination. She slid down from the horse and stood beside him, hand on the knife, hidden in her dress. "You will try," she said, her voice carrying across the distance. "You will fail." Dalton threw the torch at the cabin. It landed on the porch flames, catching immediately. "Now!" he screamed, and all hell broke loose. Victor Kane drew first, but Jack Sullivan was faster. 2 shots rang out almost simultaneously. Kane went down clutching his shoulder. Jack's hat flew off, creased by Kane's bullet. The other hired guns opened fire. Tom Crawford and Marcus took cover behind a water trough, returning fire. Samuel, youngest and fastest, sprinted toward the cabin with a bucket. Daniel drew his Colt and fired at Dalton, but the younger man had already moved, diving behind the burning barn. Return fire kicked up dirt at Daniel's feet. He pushed Ayanna toward a cover. "Get to the tree line," he ordered. "I will not leave you. I can't fight and protect you at the same time. Please." She hesitated, then ran. Daniel watched her go, making sure she reached safety. Then he turned his attention back to the fight. It was chaos, gunfire and screaming, and the roar of flames. The barn collapsed with a thunderous crash, sending sparks shooting into the sky. The cabin was fully engulfed now, 4 years of memories burning to ash. But Daniel couldn't think about that, could only focus on the men trying to kill him. He fired twice more, dropped one of the hired guns. Tom Crawford got another. That left Dalton and 2 others. Dalton emerged from behind the barn, wild-eyed and desperate. He fired wildly, bullets going everywhere. One struck Ranger. The horse screamed and went down. Something broke in Daniel. That horse had carried him through the war, had been his companion through 4 years of grief, and this spoiled, vicious boy had killed her out of spite. Daniel walked forward, firing with cold precision. 1 shot, 2. The remaining hired guns fell. That left only Dalton. The young man's gun clicked empty. He looked at it stupidly, then at Daniel advancing through the smoke and chaos. Terror replaced the madness in his eyes. "Please," he said, "don't." Daniel raised his Colt. His finger tightened on the trigger. He could end this. End Dalton Hargrove. Make sure he never threatened anyone again. "Daniel!" Ayanna's voice, soft but clear. He turned. She stood at the edge of the clearing, smoke swirling around her like a ghost. "He is beaten," she said. "You do not need to kill him. He deserves it." "Yes, but you are not a murderer." "Do not become one now." Daniel looked back at Dalton, cowering on the ground, looked at his burning home, his dead horse, everything destroyed. But Ayanna was right. Killing Dalton wouldn't bring any of it back, would only make Daniel into something he'd hate. He lowered the gun. "Get out of here," he told Dalton, "and if I ever see you again, I won't be so merciful." Dalton scrambled to his feet and ran, disappearing into the trees. The fight was over. Marshal Grant examined the bodies. Victor Kane had bled out from his shoulder wound, too far from help. The other hired guns were either dead or would hang for murder and arson. Justice swift and final. Victor Kane and the other hired guns were dead or wounded. The fire still burned, but Samuel had managed to save part of the cabin. The barn was gone completely. Daniel walked back to where Ranger had fallen. The horse was still alive, but barely. Blood pooled beneath her. Her breathing was labored and wet. He knelt beside her, placed a hand on her neck. "Easy, girl, easy." Her eyes found his, trusting, loyal to the end. Daniel drew his Colt one more time, put the barrel to her head. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." He pulled the trigger. The sound echoed across the valley. Final and terrible. An ending. Ayanna came to stand beside him, tears on her cheeks. She knelt and put her hand over Daniel's. They stayed like that for a long moment, mourning a faithful friend. Around them, the others gathered, tired, smoke-stained, but alive. They'd won. At terrible cost, but they'd won. Marshal Grant rode up with Sheriff Bridger, surveying the destruction. "Jesus," Grant breathed. "I'm sorry, Mackenzie. If we'd gotten here sooner—" "You got here," Daniel said. "That's what matters. Dalton Hargrove. He ran. North, I think. We'll find him. He'll face justice for this." Daniel nodded, too exhausted to care much. Justice felt hollow when everything you owned was ash and smoke. But then Ayanna squeezed his hand, and he realized he was wrong. He hadn't lost everything. The things that truly mattered were still here, still standing. He had Ayanna. He had friends. He had his life and his freedom and his honor. The rest could be rebuilt. Part 6. Forever Home. 6 months had passed since the fire. Spring had come to Wyoming, melting the snow and painting the valley in shades of green and gold. Wildflowers dotted the meadows purple and yellow against the new grass. The air smelled of pine and earth and possibility. Daniel stood in front of the newly rebuilt barn hammer in hand, admiring the work. It wasn't fancy, but it was solid. Straight walls, strong roof doors that hung true. Better than the old one in some ways, built with help from friends who'd given their time freely, asking nothing in return. The cabin had been rebuilt 2 larger this time, 2 bedrooms instead of 1. A real kitchen with a proper stove that Ruth Morrison had insisted they needed. Windows with glass instead of oiled paper. It looked like a home instead of just a place to wait out the days. Footsteps behind him. Daniel turned to see Ayanna approaching, carrying a basket covered with cloth. She wore a simple blue dress, one she'd sewn herself, from fabric Tom Crawford's wife had given her. Her hair was loose today, falling past her shoulders in dark waves. The scars on her neck had faded to thin white lines, barely visible unless you knew to look. She was beautiful. More so every day as health and happiness replaced the haunted look she'd worn when he first found her in that cage. "You are supposed to be resting," Daniel said, though he smiled as he said it. "I have rested enough. I brought you lunch." She set the basket down on a newly built fence post. "And I wanted to see the progress." "Almost done. Another week and we can move the horses in." They'd bought 2 new horses with money from the territorial government compensation for the destruction caused by the Hargroves. Not much, but enough to start rebuilding. A mare named Copper and a gelding called Dusty. Good animals, steady and reliable. Ayanna unwrapped the basket, revealing fresh bread, cheese, and cold chicken. They sat together on the grass, eating in comfortable silence. This had become their ritual. Lunch together no matter how busy the day. A moment to simply be. "Ruth came by this morning," Ayanna said eventually. "She brought news from town. Good news or bad? Good, I think. Dalton Hargrove was caught in Montana. He is being brought back to stand trial." Daniel chewed thoughtfully. He'd thought often about that moment when he could have killed Dalton but didn't. Sometimes he wondered if it had been the right choice. But looking at Ayanna, now seeing the approval in her eyes, he knew it had been. "And Clayton," he asked, "still in prison?" "The trial is set for August. Ruth says the evidence is overwhelming. He will spend the rest of his life behind bars." Good. They'd had justice in the end. Not the quick, violent kind that came from a gun, but the slower, surer kind that came from law. It felt better this way, cleaner, like they'd won without becoming what they fought against. "There is other news," Ayanna said, and something in her tone made Daniel look up. She was smiling, a secret kind of smile that made his heart skip. "Dr. Walsh came with Ruth." "Are you sick?" "You should have told me." "I am not sick." Her smile widened. "I am pregnant." The world stopped. Daniel stared at her, unable to process the words. "Pregnant? A baby?" "Their baby." "You're certain?" "Dr. Walsh is certain. He says the child will come in December when the snow is deep." She took his hand and placed it on her stomach, still flat, but somehow different now that he knew. "We are going to have a family, Daniel Mackenzie." Emotion crashed over him like a wave. Joy and terror and wonder all mixed together. He thought about Margaret, about James, about the family he'd lost and never thought he'd have again, about the cruelty of losing them and the miracle of being given a second chance. "A baby," he said, his voice rough. "We're having a baby." "Yes." He pulled her close and kissed her, tasting salt, realized he was crying, didn't care. Let the tears fall, because they were happy tears. Healing tears, the kind that washed away old grief and made room for new joy. When they finally pulled apart, Ayanna was crying too. "Are you happy?" she asked. "Happy doesn't begin to cover it." He pressed his forehead to hers. "Terrified, grateful, overwhelmed, but yes, incredibly happy." "Me too. I did not think I would ever feel this way again. After losing Kaya and Nayeli, I thought that part of my life was over. But now we get to start again, build something new from everything we've lost." They sat there for a long time, holding each other, letting the news settle. A child, new life born from the ashes of the old. It felt like the universe finally balancing its scales. That evening, they rode into town to share the news. Ruth Morrison cried and hugged them both. Dr. Walsh gave stern instructions about Ayanna's health. Reverend Hayes blessed them, and a promise to baptize the child when it came. Even the townspeople who'd been wary of Ayanna 6 months ago now offered congratulations. She'd won them over slowly, treating their ailments with her herbal medicines, helping birth babies, sitting with the dying. They'd seen her kindness, her skill, her humanity. The fear had faded, replaced by respect. Jack Sullivan bought them drinks at the saloon, though Ayanna only had water. "To new beginnings," he toasted, "and to the best damn couple I know." They drank. They laughed. They celebrated. And for the first time since coming to Broken Pine, Daniel felt like he truly belonged. Not just tolerated, but welcomed. Part of something larger than himself. As they rode home under a canopy of stars, Ayanna leaned back against Daniel's chest. "Do you think about them?" she asked quietly. "Margaret and James, every day. Does it make you sad to think of starting a new family?" Daniel considered the question. A year ago the answer would have been yes, would have felt like betrayal to even imagine replacing what he'd lost. But time and love had softened the sharp edges of grief. "No," he said. "I think they'd be happy for us. Margaret wanted me to live, not just exist. And this, what we have, this is living. I think about Dakota and my daughters too. Wonder what they would think of you, of this life. What do you think they'd say? Dakota would say you are a good man, a worthy husband. Kaya and Nayeli would have loved you. You are gentle with small things, patient. They would have followed you everywhere asking questions." Daniel's throat tightened. "I would have liked that." "And this baby," Ayanna continued, her hand on her stomach, "I think they would be happy. There will be a child to carry forward, to remember them through stories and love. We'll tell this baby about all of them, James and Kaya and Nayeli, Margaret and Dakota. They'll know they come from love, even if that love came with loss." "Yes, that is good." They reached the ranch and settled the horses for the night. Inside the cabin, Daniel built up the fire while Ayanna prepared tea from herbs she'd gathered. They sat together in the warmth, talking about the future, names for the baby, whether it would be a boy or a girl, how to prepare the second bedroom as a nursery, small domestic conversations that felt precious because they were choosing them together. "If it is a boy," Ayanna said, "I would like to name him James Dakota, to honor both our sons who came before. And if it's a girl, Margaret Kaya, for the same reason." Daniel felt his eyes burning again. They would have liked that, all of them. "I hope so." As the night deepened, they moved to the bedroom, made love slowly, carefully aware of the new life growing between them. Afterward, Ayanna fell asleep with her head on Daniel's chest, one hand still resting on her stomach. Daniel lay awake, listening to her breathe, thinking about the journey that had brought them here, from a cage and $8 to this moment, from strangers to husband and wife, from broken souls to people learning how to be whole again. It wasn't perfect. They still had nightmares sometimes, still carried scars, visible and invisible, but they had each other. And now they'd have a child. A family built not on forgetting the past, but on honoring it while moving forward. He thought about the iron collar buried deep beneath the oak tree, about the marriage certificate framed and hanging in the cabin, about the friends who'd stood with them when it mattered, about justice served and love found, and second chances freely given. Life was strange, brutal and beautiful in equal measure. You could lose everything and still find reasons to keep going, could be broken beyond repair and still somehow heal. He kissed the top of Ayanna's head and closed his eyes. Tomorrow they'd continue rebuilding, would work the land, tend the animals, prepare for the baby coming, would live the quiet, ordinary life they'd fought so hard to have. And it would be enough, more than enough. It would be everything. 3 years later, December 1880. Snow fell softly on the Mackenzie Ranch, blanketing everything in white silence. Inside the cabin, warmth and noise and life. Margaret Kaya Mackenzie, 2 years old, sat on the floor near the fireplace playing with wooden blocks her Uncle Jack had carved. She had her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin. Her hair was black as midnight, braided with the same careful precision Ayanna used on her own. In the rocking chair by the window, Ayanna nursed their second child, James Dakota Mackenzie, 6 months old, fat and healthy and content. He'd been born in late summer during a thunderstorm, coming into the world with a lusty cry that announced his intention to be heard. Daniel stood at the stove, attempting to make supper without burning it. Cooking was not his strength, but Ayanna was tired, and he wanted to give her rest. The venison was probably overcooked and the potatoes definitely lumpy, but it was edible, mostly. A knock at the door interrupted his culinary struggles. He opened it to find Ruth Morrison standing there, arms full of packages. "Merry early Christmas," she announced, bustling inside. "I couldn't wait until tomorrow." Margaret squealed and ran to Ruth, who scooped her up with practiced ease. "Hello, little one. My, you've grown." "She's gotten too big to carry," Ayanna said, smiling, but she does not believe it yet. Children never do. Ruth set Margaret down and distributed packages. For the children mostly, And something for you two as well." They opened gifts like a real family. Warm socks Ruth had knitted, a new dress for Ayanna, a shirt for Daniel, toys for the children that would be loved and broken and treasured. After Ruth left, promising to return for Christmas dinner the next day, they sat together in the peaceful cabin. Margaret had fallen asleep on the floor surrounded by her new toys. James was content in his mother's arms, making small baby noises. "Happy?" Daniel asked Ayanna. "Very. You, more than I ever thought possible." It was true. The ranch had prospered. They'd added cattle, expanded the fields, made enough to live comfortably if not richly. But the real wealth was this: family, love, peace. Ayanna's clinic had grown too. People came from 50 miles around seeking her remedies. She'd trained 2 younger women in her techniques, passing on knowledge her mother had given her. The Apache healing traditions lived on, helping people regardless of the color of their skin. The townspeople called her Mrs. Mackenzie now, greeted her with respect, asked after her health and her children. She'd become part of the community through patience and persistence and undeniable skill. Clayton Hargrove had died in prison that spring. Heart attack, the papers said. Daniel felt nothing when he heard. Not satisfaction, not anger, just indifference. The man had become irrelevant, a ghost from a life that felt distant now. Clayton Hargrove had died in prison that spring. Heart attack, the paper said. Judge Webb had been removed from the bench and fined heavily for corruption, though he'd avoided prison due to his age. He lived out his days in disgrace, a cautionary tale about the price of selling justice. Dalton had been sentenced to 10 years for arson and attempted murder. He'd serve every day of it. By the time he got out, the Hargrove empire would be dust. Other men had bought the mines, treated the workers better paid fair wages. Progress slow, but steady. As night fell completely, Daniel lit the lamps. Ayanna put James in his cradle, then picked up the sleeping Margaret and carried her to bed. Daniel followed, helping tuck their daughter under quilts. They stood together, looking down at her peaceful face. "She looks like Kaya did at that age," Ayanna whispered. "Does that make you sad?" "No, it makes me grateful. That I can remember Kaya with love instead of only pain. That her spirit lives on in our daughter." They checked on James next, who'd already fallen asleep with his fist in his mouth. Daniel adjusted his blanket while Ayanna hummed a soft Apache lullaby. Finally, they retreated to their own bedroom, undressed and climbed into bed, bodies fitting together with the ease of long practice. Outside, the snow continued falling. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. "Daniel," Ayanna said, into the darkness. "Yeah. Do you ever think about that day, the auction?" "Sometimes." "Why, I was thinking today how strange life is. If you had not stopped, if you had not paid those $8, if any of 100 small things had been different, we would not be here. But I did stop, and we are here." "Yes." She nestled closer. "I am glad you stopped." "Me too." They drifted toward sleep, comfortable and warm and safe. Tomorrow they'd wake to Christmas morning, to children's laughter and Ruth's cooking, and the ordinary magic of another day together. But tonight, in the quiet darkness, Daniel found himself thinking about all the paths that had led here. The war, the fever, the grief, the cage, the collar, the courage to choose life over death, love over fear, hope over despair. $8. That's what Ayanna's freedom had cost. The best $8 he'd ever spent. The only $8 that had ever mattered. He thought about Margaret's last words to him. "Promise me you'll never let cruelty win. Fight for those who can't fight for themselves." He'd kept that promise. In a small way, in his corner of the world, he'd fought and won. Not through violence, but through persistence. Through refusing to accept that might made right. Through standing up when it would have been easier to look away. And in return, he'd been given this. A second chance at family, at love, at life itself. The ranch would be here long after they were gone, he thought. Their children would inherit it. Their grandchildren. Generation after generation, built on the foundation of 2 people who'd refused to give up, who'd chosen each other when the world said they shouldn't, who'd built a home from ashes and hope. That was the legacy they'd leave. Not land or money or reputation, but the simple truth that love could triumph over hate, that broken people could heal, that second chances existed for those brave enough to take them. Ayanna's breathing had evened out. She was asleep, safe in his arms. Daniel kissed her hair and closed his eyes, letting himself drift. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. Cattle to feed, children to raise, a ranch to run, the endless work of building a life. But tonight all was well. The storm outside couldn't touch them. The ghosts of the past had been laid to rest. The future stretched ahead, uncertain but full of promise. Daniel Mackenzie and Ayanna, two names that would fade from memory when they were gone. Just another couple who'd lived and loved and died in the Wyoming Territory. But to each other, they were everything, savior and saved, husband and wife. The person who made life worth living. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The snow fell, the fire burned, the children slept, and in a small cabin beneath the shadow of the Bighorn Mountains, a family rested, safe, together. Home at last. Some promises were worth everything it cost to keep them. Blood didn't make family. Love did. And love, Daniel had learned, was the only thing strong enough to overcome everything the world could throw at you. He held his wife close and let sleep take him secure in the knowledge that tomorrow and all the tomorrows after they would face together, forever. The word echoed in his dreams. A promise, a truth, a life fully lived, forever and always. The end.